And there are many indicators just over the last number of years that while this divide has always been wide and has always been problematic since the beginning of the state, it is becoming even more problematic. And that is, there's been a serious deterioration over the past 10 years or so in this relationship. There are many, many indicators of this deterioration. And in the book, we discuss this deterioration in some detail, and I will just briefly point to a few of these indicators now, and I'd be happy to elaborate on them in the Q&A that follows. First of all, perhaps one of the most significant events in the history of the Palestinian minority's relationship with the state were the events that took place in October 2000. Shortly after the outbreak of the Second Intifada, when large numbers of the Palestinian community in Israel mobilized in protest, both against Israel's actions in the Second Intifada, the deaths of Palestinians in the occupied territories, as well as their disappointment over the collapse of the peace process, but also demonstrated against this discrimination and inequality that they have long faced inside Israel. And in response to these massive demonstrations and the rioting that took place within them, the Israeli police fired upon the demonstrators, used lethal force, and 12 Palestinian citizens were killed as a result. This event, these October events, in many respects mark a turning point in the relationship between the state and the Palestinian minority. The bitterness within the Palestinian minority that was engendered by those events and the police's heavy-handed reaction to them has not been alleviated. If anything, in fact, it has intensified in the years since. Other notable events in this deterioration of the relationship between Jews and Palestinians inside Israel were the publication in 2006-2007 of a number of documents by leading Palestinian advocacy organizations inside Israel, known collectively as the Vision documents. Essentially, these documents described in some detail what vision the Palestinian community as a whole had for their future relationship in Israel. And what was most controversial about these documents was their call for Israel to become a binational state. Essentially, these documents collectively described Israel as the product of colonialism. They regarded Zionism as essentially akin to a colonial movement and called for the abolition of Israel as a Jewish state. Now, needless to say, this did not go down well with the Israeli Jewish public. Already, as I said, relations had been deteriorating. And this really exacerbated this deterioration as the Palestinian minority were now seen as overtly calling for the dismantling of the Jewish state, something which is a complete anathema to Israeli Jews. And so this contributed to this deterioration in the relationship. On the Israeli Jewish side, we've seen, so on the one hand, Palestinian community in Israel have become increasingly assertive in calling for essentially the abolition of Israel as a Jewish state, believing that there is no way that they can achieve equality within Israel as long as Israel remains a Jewish state. That's essentially their belief, that the reason for their discrimination stems from Israel's definition as a Jewish state, and the only way that they can end this discrimination and achieve equality is by abolishing Israel as a Jewish state. On the Israeli Jewish side, the perception is increasingly that the Palestinians are becoming radicalized. The Vision documents are one example of this radicalization, and are therefore in danger of becoming a security threat to Israel in the event of another intifada or in the event of a war between Israel and, say, Hezbollah. Hezbollah has made active efforts at recruiting Palestinians inside Israel. They're also, and have long been seen as a demographic threat to the country. And so this perception of the Palestinian minority in Israel as a threat has generated increasing discussion within Israel, within Israeli Jewish society, about the possibility of transferring this minority, this population. Essentially, hopefully, as they see it, through a kind of voluntary transfer, and if not, through some sort of territorial exchange, whereby a future Palestinian state would annex Palestinian populated areas adjacent to that state within Israel in exchange for Israel's annexation of areas in the West Bank populated by Israeli settlers. Needless to say, this has seriously alarmed the Palestinian community in Israel. So what we have, in short, is a growing fears on both sides of this divide, as each side increasingly views the other as an enemy. And these perceptions and attitudes, which have worsened over the last decade, have been, in some cases, manipulated, in some cases, inflamed by politicians on both sides. Now, the most notable instance in Israel is the present foreign minister, Avigdor Lieberman, whose party, Yisrael Beitenu, has essentially campaigned on an anti-Arab platform, has garnered a great deal of support within the Israeli Jewish public on the basis of this anti-Arab platform, and has been leading the way in Israel's current parliament, in the Knesset, in passing legislation aimed at essentially restricting the political freedoms as well as the civil rights of the Palestinian community inside Israel. Okay, so this is the situation. Clearly, it is a very negative situation. It is constantly deteriorating, and we fear that if major action isn't taken to reverse this deterioration and to change the course of events, the conflict within, as we describe it, is liable to explode. In other words, there's a real danger of Jewish-Palestinian violence inside Israel, the erosion of Palestinian civil rights within Israel, and the progressive undermining of Israeli democracy. Now, you might think that the solution to this is simply to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As I said, we do not think that while resolving the conflict is certainly essential, this by itself will not resolve this internal conflict. It may well exacerbate the internal conflict. A Palestinian state will not solve the problems of the Palestinian minority in Israel. In fact, many Israeli Jews may see a Palestinian state as the solution, and they may well encourage or even demand Palestinian citizens who wish to identify as members of the Palestinian nation to live in such a state. So some of the right-wing exclusionary tendencies that are occurring inside Israel today could well, in fact, develop and be strengthened by the establishment of a Palestinian state. At the same time, if that state were to come about as a result and require the removal of Jewish settlers, as would necessarily be the case, many of those Jewish settlers may well do as the Gaza settlers who were relocated after the withdrawal from Gaza and move into Arab towns and neighborhoods inside Israel. This is something that's already happened. The settlers who were relocated from Gaza moved into Arab towns and neighborhoods, and this exacerbated already fragile relations in those communities. So there's a lot of dangers that could happen even with the establishment of a Palestinian state. But that's unlikely to happen in any case, as long as Israel insists, as it presently does, that the Palestinian Authority recognize Israel as a Jewish state. There are many reasons why we should be, unfortunately, pessimistic about the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. But Israel's present demand of the Netanyahu government for the Palestinian Authority to recognize Israel as a Jewish state in return for Israel's recognition of a Palestinian state is, in our opinion, likely to be a deal breaker. Because the Palestinian Authority cannot make that recognition as long as the Palestinian minority inside Israel are so strongly opposed to Israel as a Jewish state.